The kettle hissed from the kitchen counter, a thin thread of steam curling toward the overhead light. I watched it rise and disappear, much like the words my daughter had just spoken, sharp at first, then dissolving into the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the sound of my own careful breathing. Well then, don't expect to stay. She sat across from me at the dining table where we'd shared thousands of meals, her hands folded with the same precision I'd taught her as a child. The irony wasn't lost on me. Those hands, now demanding something I couldn't give, had once been small enough to cup around a lightning bug, gentle enough to tend scraped knees. Now they gripped the edge of my grandmother's oak table like it was already hers to claim. The words stay hung in the air between us, heavy as the August humidity that made the windows weep. Some words sound kind, until you listen for the edge. This one cut clean through 37 years of assuming home was more than an address, that family was more than conditional love served with ultimatums and the careful arrangement of guilt. I lifted my teacup, noting how my hand remained steady despite the tremor I felt somewhere deeper, in the place where certainty used to live. The porcelain was thin enough to see the tea's amber shadow through the bottom, delicate as the relationship we'd both just watched crack down the middle. The steam rose from the surface in miniature clouds, and I found myself thinking of how water changes forms so easily, solid to liquid to vapor, while keeping its essential nature intact. I heard you, Sarah. My voice came out calmer than I felt, each word measured like ingredients for bread. I'm not deaf. She shifted in her chair, the leather seat creaking in a way that reminded me of my late husband's reading chair, the one I'd donated to charity 6 months after his funeral because the sound of it empty had become unbearable. Everything in this house carried the weight of memory, and now my own daughter was asking me to choose between financial complicity and emotional exile. The dining room felt smaller suddenly, crowded with the ghosts of Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, homework sessions, and late-night talks about boys and dreams and the future we'd both imagined differently. Light from the kitchen window caught the silver on the sideboard, wedding gifts from 42 years ago, polished every Sunday out of habit rather than hope that anyone would notice their shine. My key ring sat next to my purse on the counter where I'd dropped it after returning from the bank that morning. 3 keys total, house, car, and the small brass one that opened the cedar chest in my bedroom, where I kept important papers and, until recently, a naive faith that blood meant something more than leverage. The answer is still no, Sarah. I set my cup down with the softest clink against the saucer. And I won't explain it again. She stood then, smoothing her skirt with those careful hands, and I recognized the gesture from her teenage years, the same motion she'd make before delivering a practiced speech about why she deserved to stay out past curfew or why her grades weren't her fault. The difference was that now, at 41, the practiced speeches carried real consequences. Now, she held the power to make a 73-year-old woman choose between principle and shelter. Then I guess we understand each other. Her voice carried that particular brand of hurt that masquerades as dignity, the kind I'd perfected myself over the years whenever her father came home late without calling, whenever neighbors gossiped about our family's private struggles, whenever life demanded I swallow disappointment with grace. I watched her collect her purse, check her reflection in the hallway mirror, and pause at the front door with her hand on the knob. For a moment, I thought she might turn around, might remember that some things shouldn't be for sale, not even to family. Instead, she opened the door to the evening air thick with the promise of rain and stepped onto the porch without looking back. The house settled around me in the way old houses do, shifting and sighing as if releasing a breath it had been holding. I remained at the dining table, watching the steam from my tea grow thinner and finally disappear, leaving only the faint scent of bergamot and the realization that 30 days from now, everything would be different. They think staying is owed, I thought, like gratitude or forgiveness or the signature they'd demanded at the bank that morning. They think love means signing papers without reading them, means trading away security for the appearance of family solidarity. They're wrong. I rose from the table and moved to the kitchen window, where the last light of day filtered through gauze curtains I'd sewn during my first year in this house. The neighbor's dog barked once, then settled. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Life continued its steady rhythm while mine prepared to change key entirely. By this time next month, I will know the precise weight of a suitcase packed with only essentials. I would understand how marigold smell and soil I'd turned myself, how the sound of my own key in a door I'd chosen echoes differently than one inherited through marriage and circumstance. I would have written letters I'd never send and discovered that some bridges burn quietly, with less drama than movies suggest. There would be moving boxes labeled in my careful cursive, a new address written on the back of an envelope, and a will rewritten to reflect the difference between family and inheritance. But not revenge, never revenge. A month can be the difference between being dismissed and being deliberate, and I intended to choose the latter with the same precision I used to measure flour for Sunday bread. I would keep the tea set. That much I knew already. The bank that morning had smelled like new carpet and the particular anxiety that comes with fluorescent lighting designed to reveal every flaw. I'd sat in the loan officer's chair, Marcus, his nameplate read, young enough to be my grandson, while Sarah explained why her son needed a cosigner for his business loan. 22 is young to take on that kind of debt, I'd said, watching my grandson fidget with his phone instead of meeting my eyes. And I'm 73. What happens if I die before it's paid off? Mother. Sarah's voice carried that edge again, the one she'd been practicing since the drive over. Don't be so morbid. It's a good opportunity. Tyler's restaurant concept is solid. I looked at Tyler then, really looked at him. He had his grandfather's eyes but none of his steady presence, my late husband's jawline softened by too many years of getting what he wanted without earning it. The boy, young man, I corrected myself, wore a shirt that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week, and his car in the parking lot was newer than mine despite his alleged need for financial assistance. Tyler, I said, keeping my voice gentle. Tell me about your business plan. He glanced at his mother before speaking, and that glance told me everything I needed to know about who was really driving this conversation. It's a fusion concept. Asian Mexican. Very trendy right now. The location is perfect, right in the downtown district. How much of your own money are you putting in? Another glance at Sarah. Well, the thing is, I need to keep my savings for operating expenses and... So none. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. You want to risk my house, my security, on a business you're not willing to risk your own money on. It's not like that, Sarah interjected. It's smart financial planning. You're being careful. I finished the sentence for her. Yes, I am. Marcus shifted papers on his desk, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out in his sterile office. Mrs. Peterson, the terms are quite reasonable, and with your excellent credit score. Which I earned by being careful. I stood, gathering my purse and the reading glasses I'd needed to review documents I had no intention of signing. I'm sorry, Tyler. I hope your venture succeeds, but not with my signature. Guaranteeing its failure won't cost me my home. The silence that followed felt like standing in a doorway between two rooms, one familiar but suddenly unwelcome, the other unknown but promising the dignity of choice. I walked to the bank's entrance with Sarah's heels clicking sharply behind me on the marble floor, each step an accusation I chose not to answer. I can't believe you just embarrassed us like that, she said when we reached the parking lot. Marcus knows the whole family now. What will people think? That I have good sense. I unlocked my car door, noting how the afternoon sun made the silver paint look almost white. That I didn't survive 42 years of marriage and 2 recessions by co-signing loans for restaurants that exist only on paper. It's not just paper. Tyler has a real plan. Then he can present it to a real bank, with real collateral that isn't his grandmother's house. I drove home in silence while Sarah followed in her car, and I knew from the set of her jaw in my rearview mirror that the conversation wasn't finished. It would continue at my dining table, where she'd tried to make me understand that family means different things to different generations, that my caution was really selfishness, that love should come with fewer conditions and more signatures. It wasn't my signature they needed, it was my silence. The silence of women who've learned to swallow their concerns for the sake of family peace, who've been taught that wisdom looks like compliance when delivered by someone younger and more confident. They wanted me to nod and sign and trust that somehow, at 73, I could recover from the financial devastation of a failed restaurant venture if it came to that. But I'd already buried one dreamer, already cleaned up the mess when good intentions met poor planning. My husband had been a kind man with a generous heart and no head for business, and I'd spent the last decade of our marriage quietly selling things to cover the debts his optimism had accumulated. I wouldn't do it again, not even for a grandson who'd learned to smile his way through requests for money he'd never earned. The confrontation at the dining table had been inevitable from the moment I'd walked out of that bank. Sarah had always been like her father in that way, unable to accept that no might be a complete sentence, convinced that the right combination of pressure and patience could wear down any resistance. She'd been wrong about that, too. Morning came with the sound of rain against my bedroom window, steady and soft as breathing. I lay in bed listening to it, postponing the moment when I'd have to face the dining room where last night's ultimatum still lingered like smoke from a cigarette someone had forgotten to extinguish. The ceiling above me was painted the same cream color I'd chosen 38 years ago when we'd first bought this house, when Sarah was 4 and believed that mothers could fix anything with Band-Aids and hot chocolate. I rose and made coffee in the same pot I'd used every morning for a decade, watching the dark stream fill my favorite mug, the blue one with the hairline crack near the handle that I refused to throw away. Some things become more precious for their imperfections, I thought, running my finger along the ceramic flaw that made the mug uniquely mine. The kitchen table was small enough that I could reach across it to water the African violet that sat in a pot my mother had given me before she died. Purple blooms, soft as velvet, growing in soil I'd mixed myself because store-bought never seemed rich enough. Plants didn't make ultimatums. They didn't demand signatures or threaten withdrawal of affection. They simply grew or didn't, depending on the care they received, and they never confused love with leverage. I opened the drawer where I kept my good pens and a pad of cream-colored paper Sarah had given me last Christmas, back when she'd still believed that thoughtful gifts could soften any disagreement we might have in the future. The irony of using her present to write my Declaration of Independence wasn't lost on me, but I've learned that life's ironies often contain its deepest truths. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Things I no longer owe." The words looked stark in black ink, but not cruel. Just clear, the way a doctor's diagnosis is clear, neither kind nor unkind, simply accurate. I sat back and considered what would follow, what obligations I'd been carrying that belonged to someone else, what debts I'd inherited without signing for them. I no longer owe my grown children the sacrifice of my security for their convenience. The pen moved across the paper with a scratching sound that reminded me of my grandmother's fountain pen, the one she'd used to write letters to relatives who lived too far away to visit. She'd taught me that writing things down made them real in a way that thinking them never could, that the act of forming letters into words into sentences was its own kind of magic. I no longer owe anyone an explanation for protecting what I've worked 40 years to build. Rain continued its percussion against the windows, and I realized I was composing this list to that rhythm, slow, steady, deliberate. There was no hurry now. The ultimatum had been delivered, and I had 30 days to respond with something more thoughtful than anger, more decisive than hurt feelings. I no longer owe my silence when asked to enable poor financial decisions. The bread I'd started in the machine earlier began its kneading cycle, the motor humming in counterpoint to the rain. I'd been making bread every Tuesday for 20 years, a ritual that had once felt like an obligation but now seemed like the kind of self-care I'd never learned to prioritize. Today, the bread was just for me. Today, I could eat it warm with real butter and not worry about anyone else's dietary restrictions or preferences. I no longer owe my approval to plans I wasn't consulted about. Freedom isn't loud, it's itemized. Each line on the page felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't mine to bear. The obligations of women my age are rarely chosen, they accumulate like dust on furniture, assumed and expected, and somehow always our responsibility to manage. I no longer owe my comfort to those who've made demands of my discomfort. The coffee had grown cool while I wrote, but I drank it anyway. Cool coffee was still coffee, and I'd learned during my marriage that waiting for perfect conditions meant going without things you needed. Better to accept what was available and adjust expectations accordingly. I no longer owe my home to anyone who sees it as collateral rather than a sanctuary. Outside, the rain began to ease, and I could hear the neighbors' wind chimes singing their metallic song. Mrs. Chin next door had hung them after her husband died, and I'd initially found them annoying, too much noise at all hours, too much reminder that some losses echo longer than others. Now I appreciate their persistent music, the way they refuse to be silenced by weather or time or the complaints of people who preferred quiet grief to public mourning. I no longer owe my presence to those who've made it conditional. That line stopped me, pen suspended above a paper like a bird that had forgotten how to land. This was the one that would change everything, the acknowledgement that my daughter's ultimatum was really a gift, permission to stop pretending that family love should feel like walking on glass, that gratitude should require the sacrifice of common sense. The phone rang as I set down my pen, and I knew without looking that it would be Sarah calling to discuss last night's conversation. But some discussions are really negotiations, and some negotiations are rigged from the start. I let the machine answer while I folded the list and tucked it into the Bible my mother had given me on my wedding day, the same Bible I'd carried through every major decision in my adult life, the one that had taught me the difference between wisdom and compliance. The breadmaker chimed, indicating the cycle was complete, and I realized that some of life's most important moments are marked not by drama but by the sound of ordinary machinery finishing ordinary tasks. Bread was done. The list was written. The phone had stopped ringing. And somewhere in the combination of those simple facts, I found the certainty I'd been looking for since yesterday's drive to the bank. I would need to call the utility company to transfer service. I would need to visit the bank to update my records. I would need to find a place where the word stay meant something I chose rather than something I owed. But first, I would eat warm bread with real butter and drink another cup of coffee while making plans that belonged entirely to me. The locksmith was a compact man with careful hands and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent decades listening to stories people told while their security was being upgraded. His van sat in my driveway like a medical vehicle responding to an emergency, though the emergency in this case was more emotional than physical, the urgent need to reclaim the boundary between public and private, between family and strangers, between welcome and intrusion. "How many sets do you want?" he asked, examining the front door lock with the attention of a surgeon studying an X-ray. "2," I said, though I'd been considering this question since calling his number from the yellow pages. "One for me, one spare." The metal scent of fresh-cut keys would linger in my kitchen for hours afterward, sharp and clean as the decision itself. I watched him work, noting the precision required to create something that would open for some people and not others, a mechanical form of the same boundary I was learning to establish in less tangible ways. Rain had started again, light enough to feel more like a suggestion than weather. It speckled the windshield of his van and made the pavement shine like dark glass, reflecting the overcast sky in fragments that shifted with each drop. I found myself thinking about reflection, how it requires both a surface and light, how sometimes you can't see yourself clearly until you change your angle. "Been having break-ins in the neighborhood?" he asked, the question casual but not quite innocent. Locksmiths, I realized, were probably like bartenders or hairstylists, people whose work put them in proximity to private revelations. Something like that. I watched him remove the old deadbolt, metal pieces falling into his palm like coins from a pocket. "Sometimes the problem comes from people who have keys." He nodded without looking up, and I appreciated that he didn't press for details. There was something dignified about his assumption that I had good reasons for changing my locks, that women my age didn't make such decisions casually or without cause. The guilt arrived as predicted, settling over me like humidity, pervasive and hard to shake. This was my daughter I was locking out, the child I'd raised to believe she would always have a place in my home, always be welcome at my table. But welcome, I was learning, was different from entitlement. An invitation was different from an obligation. And love, real love, sometimes requires the courage to say no when yes would cause harm to both parties. There you go. He handed me 2 brass keys, still warm from the cutting machine. These are the only ones that'll work now. Want me to test them before I pack up? I slid the first key into the new lock, feeling the tumblers align with a precision that was both mechanical and metaphorical. The deadbolt turned with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than physics would suggest, the sound of a decision becoming irreversible. Some doors close kindly, with a soft click that acknowledges what was good about what came before while still protecting what needs to come next. Perfect, I said, pocketing one key and placing the other in the drawer where I kept spare batteries and birthday candles, small necessities for times when normal systems failed or celebration was required. After he left, I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of tea I'd made more for the warmth than the taste, watching the rain draw abstract patterns on the window. The house felt different already, though nothing visible had changed. The same furniture occupied the same spaces, the same photographs smiled from their frames on the mantel, the same clock ticked its reliable rhythm from the wall above the stove. But the quality of silence had shifted. Before, quiet in this house had felt temporary, like holding my breath while waiting for the next intrusion, the next demand, the next conversation that would require me to justify my choices to people who'd already decided they had the right to disapprove. Now, I felt owned. Chosen. Mine. I kept one key aside for Sarah, not out of immediate forgiveness but as a symbol of possibility, the chance that someday we might find our way back to a relationship built on mutual respect rather than financial manipulation. The key sat in a small dish on my bedroom dresser, next to the jewelry box that played a tinny waltz when opened and the silver frame that held my wedding photo from 42 years ago. In that photo, I was wearing my mother's pearls and a smile that believed love would be simple, that family would mean safety, that the future was something that happened to other people. I'd been young enough then to think that good intentions were sufficient protection against hard choices, that if I just loved enough and sacrificed enough and stayed quiet enough, everything would work out according to some cosmic plan that rewarded virtue with security. The woman in that photograph couldn't have imagined sitting alone at 73, changing locks to keep out her own daughter, learning that sometimes love meant disappointing people rather than enabling them. But she also couldn't have imagined the particular satisfaction of keys that answered only to her, of silence that belonged to her alone, of decisions made without consultation or compromise. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I realized the storm was moving closer rather than away. There would be more rain tonight, the kind that made houses feel like sanctuaries and solitude feel like luxury rather than punishment. I would lock the new lock before bed, test the deadbolt's resistance, and sleep with the knowledge that no one could enter my space without permission, not even family, especially not family who confused access with affection. The spare key would wait in its dish, patient as hope, ready for the day when my daughter might understand the difference between being locked out and being asked to knock. She arrived the next afternoon while I was arranging white roses in a crystal vase, the last roses from the bush my husband had planted during our 5th year of marriage, when he'd still believed that beautiful gestures could compensate for practical oversights. The doorbell rang just as I was trimming the final stem, and I knew from the particular rhythm of the chimes, 2 quick presses followed by a third longer one, that Sarah had discovered the changed locks. Mother? Her voice carried through the door with that blend of authority and injury that had become her signature tone. Mother, the key doesn't work. I set down my pruning shears and dried my hands on the dish towel I'd embroidered with yellow daisies during the early years of my marriage, when I'd still believed that making a house beautiful could make a life happy. Coming, I called, though I took my time walking to the front door, pausing to straighten a throw pillow and check my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that had learned to meet their own gaze without flinching. I'd dressed carefully this morning, choosing the blue blouse Sarah had given me for my birthday and the pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Armor disguised as ordinary clothes, dignity worn like jewelry. I opened the door to find my daughter standing on the porch with her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between confusion and indignation. Behind her, Tyler sat in the passenger seat of her car, scrolling through his phone with the studied indifference of someone trying to pretend he wasn't witnessing a family crisis. "The lock's been changed," she said, stating the obvious with the kind of emphasis that suggested I might not have realized this fact. "Yes, it has." I stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she hesitated before crossing the threshold, as if the changed lock had altered more than just the mechanics of entry. "Would you like some tea?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment, she looked younger, more like the child who used to seek comfort in my kitchen after playground disputes or disappointing report cards. "Yes. Please." I led her to the dining room where we'd had our confrontation 2 days earlier, but the atmosphere felt different now. I was no longer defending a position I'd hoped I wouldn't have to take. I was simply serving tea to a guest in my own home. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like the difference between standing on shaky ground and a solid foundation. The tea service had been a wedding gift for my husband's aunt, delicate porcelain painted with tiny blue flowers that had somehow survived 4 decades of dinner parties and family celebrations. I'd always been careful with these cups, washing them by hand and storing them in protective felt, treating them like the treasures they were. Today, as I poured the steaming amber liquid, I realized they were probably sturdier than they appeared, much like the woman handling them. "Why?" Sarah asked as I handed her a cup. Her voice was quieter now, more puzzled than angry. "Why would you change the locks without telling me?" I settled into my chair with my own tea, noting how the afternoon light caught the steam rising from the surface and turned it golden. Because having a key to someone's home is a privilege, not a right. And privileges can be revoked when they're abused. Abused? The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately modulated her tone. "Mother, I've never abused. You demanded I risk my home to co-sign a loan for a business plan I wasn't allowed to question. When I declined, you threatened to make me homeless." I sipped my tea, tasting the bergamot and lemon I'd added with the same care I'd once used to measure medicine for a feverish child. "That feels like abuse to me." Thunder rumbled overhead, and I could see rain beginning to speckle the windows. The storm I'd been watching all day was finally arriving, and I found myself grateful for the timing. There was something appropriate about having this conversation while the weather turned dramatic outside. It made our indoor conflict feel manageable by comparison. "It wasn't a threat," Sarah said, though she couldn't quite meet my eyes. "It was just. I was upset. I didn't mean it the way it sounded." Words mean what they mean, regardless of intention. I reached for the sugar bowl, a small crystal dish that had belonged to my grandmother. "And some words can't be unsaid, even when we wish they could be." She set her cup down with a slight tremor that made the porcelain sing against the saucer. The sound was delicate, musical, like wind chimes made of bone china. "So what now? You're going to cut me out of your life because of one argument?" "I'm going to protect myself from future ultimatums." The distinction was important, though I could see she didn't understand it yet. "You can visit when you're invited. You can call before you come. You can treat my home like the sanctuary it's supposed to be instead of an asset you're entitled to leverage." Rain began to hit the windows harder, driven by wind that made the old house creak in its joints. I'd always loved storms when I was safely inside, the way they made ordinary shelter feel precious and reminded you that comfort was something to be grateful for rather than assumed. Tonight's storm felt like punctuation to the conversation we were having, nature underlining the points I was trying to make about security and boundaries and the difference between being loved and being needed. "This isn't you, Mother." Sarah's voice carried a note of desperation I recognized from her teenage years, when she'd tried to argue her way out of consequences by questioning my authority rather than acknowledging her actions. "You've never been this cold." "I've never been this clear," I corrected. "There's a difference." She stood then, pacing to the window where rain now streamed down the glass in rivers that caught and reflected the lamplight. Her reflection wavered in the water-distorted surface, broken into fragments that shifted with each new droplet. "Tyler needs this loan, Mother. His whole future depends on it." Then he should find investors who believe in his plan enough to risk their own money. I remained seated, keeping my voice level. Or he should save until he can fund it himself. Or he should choose a smaller venture that matches his actual resources. You don't understand how business works now. Everything requires capital, Anne. I understand how poverty works. The words came out more sharply than I'd intended, cutting through her explanation like scissors through ribbon. I understand what happens to elderly women who co-sign loans they can't afford to honor. I understand how easy it is to lose everything you've spent a lifetime building. Lightning illuminated the room for a brief moment, followed by thunder close enough to make the windows rattle. Some storms prefer porcelain, I thought, remembering how my grandmother used to say that the most dangerous weather was often the most beautiful, the kind that looked dramatic from inside but could destroy everything you'd worked to protect if you weren't careful. I would never let anything happen to you, Sarah said, but the promise sounded hollow even to her. We both knew that intentions weren't insurance policies, that love couldn't prevent economic disaster, that good people sometimes made financial decisions that destroyed everyone around them. You already let something happen to me. I stood and began clearing the tea service, hands steady despite the weight of what I was saying. You made my security contingent on my compliance. You turned my home into collateral for a debt I didn't agree to take on. You taught my grandson that his grandmother's welfare was less important than his business dreams. I carried the cups to the kitchen, listening to her heels on the hardwood as she followed. The sound was different now, less confident, more careful, like someone walking on ice. They weren't sure whether they would hold their weight. What can I do? She asked as I rinsed the delicate porcelain under warm water, each cup singing softly as the stream hit its curved surface. How do I fix this? You respect my decision without trying to change it. You stop treating my boundaries like starting points for negotiation. You remember that I'm your mother, not your bank. I dried each cup with the same towel I'd used to dry her tears when she was small, when the problems in her life could be solved with cookies and cartoon bandages and the promise that everything would be better in the morning. She was quiet for so long that I turned to look at her, noting how the storm light from the window made her face look older, more like mine than either of us probably wanted to acknowledge. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since she was 7 and had broken my favorite serving bowl while trying to help with dinner. I'm scared, Mother. About Tyler, about money, about everything. And I thought if you helped, it would mean you believed in us. That you trusted us. Trust is earned, not commanded. I folded the dish towel and hung it on its hook, a small ritual that marked the end of this particular ceremony. And fear doesn't justify asking someone else to bear the consequences of your choices. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the foundation of the house. The lights flickered but held, and I took it as a sign that some structures were stronger than they appeared, that storms could test without necessarily destroying. I need to go, Sarah said, glancing toward the window where rain was now falling in sheets. This weather. Drive carefully. The words came automatically, the same ones I'd said every time she'd left my house for the past 25 years. But they felt different now, more like a courtesy than a commandment, the kind of thing you'd say to any guest leaving your home during inclement weather. I walked her to the door and watched from the porch as she ran to her car through the rain, Tyler sliding over to let her drive. Their windshield was fogged, and I could see her wiping it with her sleeve before starting the engine. The car backed out of my driveway with unusual care, headlights cutting through the downpour as she navigated toward the street. When they were gone, I locked the new deadbolt and stood in my entryway listening to the storm rage outside. The house felt solid around me, protective in a way it hadn't for months. Rain drummed against the roof and windows with the kind of intensity that made you grateful for good construction and sound planning, the same qualities I was learning to value in relationships. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it while reading a book I'd been saving for a quiet evening, the kind of meal and entertainment that belonged entirely to my own preferences. The storm continued until well past midnight, but I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, lulled by the rhythm of rain on the roof and the knowledge that my doors were locked against more than just the weather. The ladder appeared against my house 3 days after the storm, while I was having morning coffee and watching the neighborhood assess the damage from my kitchen window. Trees down, shingles scattered, gutters hanging loose like broken arms, the usual aftermath of weather that reminded everyone that nature was still in charge despite our best attempts to believe otherwise. I was considering whether my own gutters had survived when I heard the scrape of aluminum against siding and looked out to see Harold Webb positioning a ladder against the north wall of my house. He was 78, a widower of 6 years who lived in the blue house with the white trim 2 doors down, and we'd exchanged the kind of neighborly pleasantries that substituted for actual friendship in suburbs where everyone was too busy or too polite to risk a deeper connection. "Harold?" I called through the screen door, stepping onto my back porch in slippers and the cotton robe I'd worn through 3 decades of similar morning emergencies. "What are you doing?" "Your gutter's loose on this side," he called back, already climbing the ladder with the kind of steady confidence that comes from a lifetime of fixing things that break. "Saw it hanging yesterday after the storm. Figured I'd tighten it up before it pulls the whole section down." I should have protested, told him I could call a handyman, insisted I didn't need help from a neighbor I barely knew, maintained the careful distance that kept suburban relationships comfortable and uncomplicated. Instead, I found myself saying, "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." He paused halfway up the ladder, looking down at me with surprise that mirrored my own. "That'd be nice. Let me just get this secured first." I went inside and poured 2 cups, adding cream to mine and leaving his black because I didn't know his preferences yet. The word "yet" surprised me. When had I started thinking about getting to know Harold Webb well enough to learn how he liked his coffee? When had I stopped assuming that all my meaningful relationships were already established, that at 73 I was too old to make new friends? The sound of his work on the ladder was comforting rather than intrusive, the scrape of metal, the tap of a hammer, the satisfied grunt when a stubborn bolt finally cooperated. It reminded me of my husband's weekend projects, back when we'd believed that maintaining a house was the same as maintaining a marriage, that if you kept fixing the small problems, the big ones would never develop. "There." Harold climbed down and leaned the ladder against the house, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his back pocket. "Should hold through another few storms like that one." I handed him the coffee, and we stood on my back porch looking at the neighborhood's storm damage, 2 elderly people taking inventory of what had survived and what would need rebuilding. The morning air smelled of wet earth and fresh leaves. The particular sweetness that comes after rain has washed everything clean and left it shining. "Lost 3 branches off my oak tree," he said, nodding toward his yard where the debris still lay scattered across his lawn. "Good thing they fell away from the house. My luck, they would have taken out the kitchen window." "I'd been thinking about having my big maple trimmed," I admitted, though I hadn't actually been thinking about it until that moment. "It's gotten so large it blocks most of the afternoon sun from reaching my vegetable garden. I know a good tree service. Honest pricing, careful work. Want me to get you their number?" The offer was simple, practical, the kind of neighbor-to-neighbor courtesy that made suburban life bearable. But it felt like more than that somehow, like the beginning of the kind of mutual assistance that turned strangers into allies, isolated individuals into an informal community. "That would be helpful, thank you." We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood come alive around us. Mrs. Peterson across the street was sweeping leaves from her driveway. The young couple next door was loading storm debris into trash bags. A city truck rumbled down the street, crews assessing which trees were too damaged to save and which could be pruned back to health. "My son keeps telling me I should move to one of those retirement communities," Harold said suddenly. "Says it's too much work, maintaining a house at my age. Says I should let someone else worry about storm damage and gutter repairs." The comment hung in the air between us, and I recognized the particular weight of children who believed they knew what was best for parents who hadn't asked for their opinion. "Do you want to move?" "Hell no." He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Excuse my language. But no, I don't want to move. I like fixing my own gutters. I like knowing my neighbors well enough to fix theirs when they need it. I like being useful instead of managed. Then don't move. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended, but I didn't apologize for the intensity. You're 78, not 7. You get to decide where you live and how you spend your time. He looked at me over his coffee cup, and I could see him reassessing whatever assumptions he'd made about the polite widow who lived 2 doors down. Easy to say. Harder when your family starts treating you like you're not capable of making rational decisions anymore. I'm learning that family opinions aren't always requests for input. I took a sip of coffee, tasting the bitterness I'd grown to appreciate more than the sweetness of my younger years. Sometimes they're just noise you don't have to listen to. Sounds like you've got some experience with family noise. Recent experience. I could have left it at that, maintained the careful privacy that kept neighbors from becoming confidants. Instead, I found myself telling him about the loan demand, the ultimatum, the changed locks, not in detail, but in broad strokes that painted the picture without revealing every shadow. Some repairs start on roofs, end in hearts, I thought as Harold listened without interrupting, without offering solutions I hadn't asked for, without suggesting that family relationships required different rules than any other kind of contract. His attention was steady, respectful, the kind that acknowledged pain without trying to fix it immediately. My son thinks I should sell this house and move closer to him in Phoenix, he said when I'd finished. He says he worries about me living alone, especially after Martha died. What he really means is he wants access to my equity and control over my decisions. Are you going to do it? I'm going to finish my coffee and fix Mrs. Peterson's mailbox, which got knocked over in the storm. Then I'm going to trim those oak branches in my yard and plant the winter vegetables I've been planning since August. After that, we'll see. The sun had risen high enough to burn through the lingering clouds, and the wet surfaces around us began to steam gently in the warming air. It looked like resurrection, the world emerging from the storm changed but not defeated, marked by the weather but still fundamentally sound. Harold, I said as he handed me his empty cup. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Nothing fancy. Just 2 neighbors who understand that being useful is better than being managed. His smile was slow but genuine, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. I'd like that very much. Fair warning, though, I'm a better handyman than I am a cook. Good thing I'm better at cooking than handyman work. After he left, ladder slung over his shoulder and whistling an old tune I almost recognized, I stood on my back porch looking at the gutter he'd repaired. It was a small fix, barely noticeable from the ground, but it represented something larger, the possibility of relationships built on mutual assistance rather than obligation, friendship chosen rather than inherited, community created rather than assumed. I had Harold's number in my phone now, and the tree services information written on the back of an envelope. Small additions to my contact list, but they felt significant, proof that at 73, I was still capable of building new connections, still able to trust my judgment about which people were worth knowing better. The damaged neighborhood would recover, house by house, repair by repair, neighbor helping neighbor through the work of rebuilding. And maybe, I thought, watching Harold's figure disappear into his own backyard, that was a better model for family relationships than the one I'd been trying to maintain, less about obligation and management, more about choice and mutual respect. The afternoon sun slanted through my bedroom window as I spread my important papers across the quilted bedspread, creating an orderly landscape of documents that told the story of a life lived carefully but perhaps not always wisely. Bank statements and insurance policies, the deed to my house and the title to my car, the will I'd written 5 years ago when optimism still felt like realism and I'd believed that family love was somehow immune to financial stress. The papers rustled in the slight breeze from the open window, and I could smell the lavender I'd planted beneath the sill last spring, purple spikes that had thrived despite my initial doubts about my gardening skills. Everything seemed to be teaching me the same lesson lately, that things could flourish when given proper conditions and protection, that growth was possible even when you thought it was too late to start over. My reading glasses sat crooked on my nose as I reviewed the trust documents that had seemed so comprehensive when they were drafted. Fictional narrative, not legal/financial advice, I reminded myself, though the weight of real decisions pressed against my chest like humidity before a storm. I wasn't qualified to give counsel to anyone else, but I was certainly capable of understanding my own situation well enough to make changes that reflected my current reality rather than my former hopes. The manila folder labeled estate planning contained papers that had been organized by someone who believed in the fundamental goodness of family relationships, who couldn't imagine that love might become leverage or that generosity might be mistaken for weakness. That woman had written careful instructions for dividing assets among people she trusted, to honor her intentions, to use their inheritance wisely, to remember her with gratitude rather than calculation. I was no longer that woman. The new will would be simpler, cleaner, and less burdened by the weight of expectations that had proven unfounded. Not vindictive, I was learning that revenge was just another form of dependency, another way of letting other people's behavior control your choices. But deliberate. Intentional. Aligned with the values I wanted to support rather than the relationships I'd failed to maintain. The attorney I'd consulted had been younger than my daughter, a serious woman with careful hands and the kind of questions that revealed she'd handled similar family situations before. "You're under no legal obligation to leave your assets to family members," she'd assured me when I'd expressed guilt about my revisions. "And you're certainly not required to structure your estate in ways that enable poor financial decisions." I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes in the margins of my existing documents, marking sections for revision and areas that needed complete rewriting. The process felt archaeological somehow, uncovering layers of assumption and obligation that had accumulated over decades, distinguishing between what I'd chosen and what I'd simply accepted as inevitable. The revised trust would include specific language about co-signing loans, about using inheritance as collateral for debt, and about the difference between emergency assistance and enabling dependency. Not punitive clauses, but protective ones, guardrails that would prevent my estate from becoming a source of financial irresponsibility even after I was gone. Most of my assets would go to organizations that aligned with my values: the literacy program at the public library, the community garden that fed local food banks, and the scholarship fund for women returning to school after raising children. Groups that used money thoughtfully, that understood the difference between investment and consumption, that would honor my intentions without asking me to compromise my principles. I reserved a portion for each grandchild, but held it in trust until they reached 30, old enough, I hoped, to understand that money was a tool rather than a solution, that wealth required wisdom to be truly valuable. The conditions were simple: the funds could be used for education, home purchase, or starting a business, but only with a detailed plan and independent financial counseling. No cosigners required. The late afternoon light had turned golden by the time I finished my review, and the lavender scent had grown stronger as the day's heat released the oils in the plants. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, feeling lighter despite the weight of the decisions I'd made. There was something liberating about aligning your estate plan with your actual values rather than your familial obligations, about choosing legacy over loyalty when the two came into conflict. A soft knock at my front door interrupted my organizational work, and I looked through the peephole to see Harold standing on my porch with a covered dish in his hands. He'd changed from his work clothes into clean slacks and a button-down shirt, and his silver hair was combed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he'd taken some care with his appearance. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said when I opened the door. "I made too much chili, thought you might like some." "Fair warning, it's got some heat to it." The covered bowl was still warm in my hands, and I could smell cumin and tomatoes and the complex layering of spices that suggested hours of careful attention. "This is very thoughtful. Would you like to come in for coffee? I could use a break from paperwork." I led him to the kitchen, where late daylight filtered through the gauze curtains and made everything look soft-edged and peaceful. The chili smelled like comfort food, like the kind of meal that tasted better when shared, and I realized I'd been eating alone so long I'd forgotten the simple pleasure of having someone else's cooking grace my table. "Estate planning?" he asked, noticing the manila folders still visible on the dining room table. Revisions. I poured coffee into 2 cups, remembering to ask about cream and sugar this time, learning the small details that turned strangers into friends. Updating my will to reflect some recent changes in family dynamics. His nod suggested he understood exactly what kind of changes I meant. I did the same thing about 2 years ago. Amazing how much clearer your thinking becomes when you stop trying to prevent hurt feelings and start protecting your actual interests. Did your son take it well? Harold's laugh was dry but not bitter. He took it about as well as you'd expect. Lots of talk about family loyalty and ungrateful parents and how I was punishing him for caring about my welfare. Took him about 6 months to realize I wasn't negotiating. How do you feel about it now? Like I should have done it 10 years earlier. He stirred cream into his coffee with deliberate motions, and I watched his hands, steady, capable, marked by decades of work but still sure in their movements. Funny how much better you sleep when your estate plan actually reflects your values instead of your fears. We sat at my kitchen table as the light outside continued to fade, talking about practical things, the difference between enabling and supporting, the challenge of setting boundaries with people who'd never respected them, the surprising relief that came from making decisions based on wisdom rather than sentiment. It wasn't a romantic conversation, but it felt intimate in the way that sharing hard-won knowledge always does. I'm leaving the bulk of my estate to the community college, he told me as we finished our coffee. Martha and I always believed in education, and they've got programs that help people start over when life doesn't go according to plan. Seems like a better legacy than funding my son's early retirement. I'm funding literacy programs and community gardens, I admitted. Places where money grows instead of gets consumed. To growing things, he said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast that felt entirely sincere. To growing things, I agreed, and realized we were talking about more than estate planning. We were talking about the unexpected flowering that could happen when you stopped trying to cultivate relationships that demanded too much fertilizer and not enough sunlight. After Harold left, I returned to my papers with renewed clarity. The final instructions were easier to write now, informed by the knowledge that other people had faced similar choices and survived the aftermath. My assets would go where they could do the most good, not where family obligations suggested they should land. I sealed the documents in an envelope and placed them in the cedar chest where I kept my most important papers, next to my marriage certificate and the birth certificates of my children and the deed to the house that would someday belong to someone who understood that shelter was a privilege rather than an entitlement. The evening air carried the scent of lavender through my open bedroom window as I prepared for bed, and I fell asleep thinking about gardens, how they required both nurturing and pruning, how sometimes the most loving thing you could do was remove what wasn't growing healthy, how the best soil was often what remained after you'd cleared away what was taking up too much space. The coat hung in my bedroom closet like a monument to good intentions, navy wool with bone buttons that I'd bought during the first year of my marriage when I'd still believed that having nice things would make me a better wife, a more successful woman, someone worthy of the life I was trying to build. I'd worn it to job interviews and school conferences, to Christmas services and funeral parlors, through 42 years of occasions that required dignity and warmth in equal measure. Now it would stay behind, folded carefully in tissue paper and left in the closet of the house where it had lived longer than most of my relationships had lasted. Not because I didn't want it anymore, but because some gestures required sacrifice to carry their intended meaning. I was learning that grace was often inconvenient, that forgiveness sometimes cost more than revenge, that the distance between punishment and protection was measured in small acts of deliberate kindness. The rest of my clothes fit into 3 suitcases and 2 garment bags, a lifetime of fashion choices condensed to what was truly necessary for a woman starting over at 73. I'd kept the practical pieces, good shoes that supported my feet, sweaters that didn't require special care, dresses that worked for both grocery shopping and church attendance. Everything else was being donated to the women's shelter downtown, where wardrobes were often casualties of emergency departures and new beginnings came without adequate preparation time. Packing was archaeological work, each layer revealing different eras of my identity. The power suits from my brief career as a bookkeeper at the elementary school. The flowing skirts from my Earth Mother phase in the 70s, when I believed that natural fibers could somehow make family life more authentic. The collection of blazers from my volunteer years, when looking professional, had felt like a requirement for being taken seriously by people half my age. At the bottom of my jewelry box, wrapped in a silk scarf that smelled faintly of the perfume I'd worn on my wedding day, I found the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday. "These belong to my mother," she'd said, fastening them in my ears with fingers that trembled slightly from age and arthritis. "Someday they'll belong to your daughter, and then to hers." That's how love travels, in small objects that outlast the people who wore them. I held the earrings up to catch the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom window, noting how the pearls seemed to glow from within. Sarah had admired them at family gatherings, had asked more than once when they might be passed down to her, the way heirlooms were supposed to move through generations according to some unwritten law about maternal inheritance. But Sarah hadn't earned these earrings yet, hadn't learned the difference between wanting beautiful things and being worthy of their history. These pearls had been worn by women who understood that elegance was about character rather than decoration, that true value lay in the integrity of the person wearing the jewelry rather than the price of the stones themselves. I wrapped them carefully and placed them in the overnight bag I'd packed for my first night in the cottage I'd rented across town. They would come with me to my new life, these small circles of light that connected me to women who'd faced their own hard choices with dignity intact. Someday, perhaps, they would find their way to Sarah or to Tyler's eventual wife or to some young woman I hadn't met yet who would understand their true worth. The cedar chest at the foot of my bed held the items I wasn't taking but couldn't bear to discard: photo albums from happier years, my husband's watch and wedding ring, the baby clothes I'd saved from when Sarah and her brother were small. These would stay in the house until my daughter was ready to claim them, until she could sort through the remnants of our shared history without anger clouding her judgment. Some weights are lighter when left on hangers, I thought, closing the closet door on the navy coat and the years of careful appearances it represented. The woman who'd bought that coat had been trying so hard to be worthy of other people's approval that she'd forgotten to ask whether their approval was worth earning. The woman packing to leave was more interested in her own respect than anyone else's opinion. Memory flashes interrupted my practical work like lightning, illuminating familiar landscapes from unexpected angles. Sarah at 7, trying on my high heels and declaring she would be a beautiful lady like Mommy when she grew up. Sarah was 16, borrowing my lipstick for her first formal dance. Sarah, at 25, was asking for my recipe for pot roast because she wanted to cook something special for her new boyfriend. When had we stopped sharing small intimacies? When had our conversations become negotiations instead of discoveries? When had I become an obstacle to overcome rather than a resource to appreciate? The questions had no comfortable answers, so I set them aside and continued packing. The present required attention, and the future needed preparation. The past could wait for a day when I had the luxury of nostalgia without the pressure of immediate decisions. I was folding sweaters when Harold appeared at my kitchen door, knocking softly before peering through the screen. "Saw the moving truck outside," he called. "Thought you might need help with boxes." "That's very kind." I opened the door to let him in, noting how natural it felt to have him in my kitchen, how easily he'd become part of the informal support system I was building to replace the family relationships that had become too costly to maintain. "Most of the heavy lifting is done, but I could use help loading my car." He surveyed the neat stacks of boxes labeled in my careful handwriting: kitchen essentials, books, linens, personal items. The organization reflected decades of managing household moves with military precision, though this move felt different, less like relocation and more like liberation. "You sure about this place you're renting?" he asked as we carried boxes to my car. "It's not too isolated?" "It's perfect," I assured him, though I hadn't seen the cottage in person yet, only photos online and a brief phone conversation with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who owned the property and understood what it meant to need a fresh start at an age when most people assumed your story was already written. The cottage sat on 3 acres at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by marigolds the previous tenant had planted and maintained until her death last spring. It came furnished with basics, a bed, a kitchen table, 2 comfortable chairs, and it included a small greenhouse where I could garden year-round if I chose. The rent was reasonable, the lease was month to month, and Mrs. Patterson had asked no questions about why a woman my age was starting over in a house designed for one. "Most important thing is that you feel safe there," Harold said, loading the last box into my trunk with the careful attention he gave to all physical tasks. "And that you've got good neighbors if you need them. The woman who owns it says the nearest house is about a quarter mile through the woods, but there's a path between the properties that gets used regularly. Seems like the right balance, close enough for help, far enough for privacy." We stood in my driveway looking at the house I'd called home for 38 years, its white clapboard siding and green shutters as familiar as my own reflection. The moving truck had taken the furniture I'd chosen to keep, my grandmother's rocking chair, the kitchen table that had survived countless family meals, the bed where I'd slept beside my husband through 4 decades of ordinary nights and extraordinary crises. What remained looked smaller somehow, like a stage set after the important props had been removed. The house would be fine without me, houses always were. They existed to shelter whoever needed them, without attachment to particular occupants or loyalty to specific histories. I was learning to be more like houses in that way, useful without being possessive, protective without being controlling. "You'll keep an eye on things here?" I asked Harold, though I knew Sarah would probably change the locks again within days of my departure. Still, it felt important to have someone I trusted aware of the transition, someone who understood that my leaving was a choice rather than an abandonment. "Of course. And you've got my number if you need anything at the new place. I'm handy with plumbing and electrical work, and I don't mind driving out to help a friend." The word friend settled between us like a gift neither of us had expected to receive at this stage of our lives. I'd spent so much energy maintaining family relationships that I'd forgotten how simple friendship could be, how it could develop naturally from mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation and historical accident. My car was loaded with everything I needed for the immediate future, and the cottage was waiting with its promise of marigolds and solitude and the particular peace that comes from choosing your own company over other people's demands. I hugged Harold goodbye, a quick, practical embrace that acknowledged affection without making it complicated, and drove away from the house where I'd learned to be a wife and mother, where I'd buried dreams and raised children and slowly forgotten that my own happiness mattered as much as anyone else's. The cottage road was exactly as Mrs. Patterson had described, gravel that crunched under my tires, bordered by oak trees that formed a canopy overhead and filtered the late afternoon light into patterns that shifted and danced with each breath of wind. I could smell earth and growing things, the particular sweetness of air that hadn't been processed through traffic and crowds, and the accumulated anxiety of suburban neighborhoods. The house appeared around the final curve like something from a fairy tale designed for women my age, small but not cramped, painted yellow with white trim, surrounded by flower beds that blazed with marigolds in every shade from pale butter to deep orange. The previous tenant had clearly been a gardener who understood that some flowers were worth the effort, that marigolds were sturdy enough to thrive even when tended by someone whose attention was divided between growing things and staying alive. I parked beside the cottage and sat for a moment in my car, taking in the reality of what I'd chosen. This was home now, not the grand house where I'd raised my children and entertained my husband's colleagues and tried so hard to create the appearance of domestic success. This was a place where I could drink my morning coffee on a porch that faced east toward the sunrise, where I could plant vegetables without worrying about property values, where the only opinion that mattered was my own. The key Mrs. Patterson had given me turned easily in the lock, and the door opened to reveal rooms that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil, spaces that had been cleaned and prepared for someone starting over. The furniture was simple but comfortable, a bed with a quilt in blues and yellows, a kitchen table just large enough for one person and a guest, 2 chairs positioned to catch the light from windows that looked out on the marigolds. I unpacked my essentials first, tea and coffee, bread and butter, the necessities that would let me make this place home before I worried about making it perfect. The rhythm of putting familiar objects in unfamiliar spaces felt like a meditation, each cup and plate and book finding its place in this new geography of independence. By evening, I had arranged my belongings in ways that pleased me, hung my clothes in a closet that was mine alone, and set up my reading corner beside the window where I could watch the marigolds wave in the breeze that carried the scent of earth and possibility through the screens. The cottage felt like a sanctuary in the truest sense, not just safe, but sacred, a place where I could discover who I was when I wasn't busy being what other people needed. I made a simple dinner from ingredients I'd brought with me and ate it on the small porch as the sun set through the oak trees, painting the marigolds in shades of gold that seemed to glow from within. Somewhere in the woods, a mourning dove called to its mate, the sound lonely but not sad, more like a recognition of solitude as a choice rather than a punishment. After dinner, I walked through the flower beds with the same careful attention I'd once given to monitoring my children's homework and my husband's moods. The marigolds were planted in informal clusters, some tall enough to reach my waist, others compact and bushy near the ground. They would bloom until the first frost, Mrs. Patterson had told me, and then I could collect their seeds for next year's garden if I chose to stay. Plant what returns even in neglect, I thought, touching the velvet petals of a flower that had survived drought and storm and the death of the woman who'd planted it. There was something hopeful about that kind of persistence, that faith in seasons and renewal and the possibility that what you started might outlast your ability to tend it. That night, I slept in my new bed with windows open to the sound of wind in the oak trees and the distant calling of owls hunting in the darkness. The silence was different here, not empty but full, rich with the sounds of things growing and living according to their own rhythms rather than human schedules. I dreamed of gardens and keys and tea served in cups that belonged entirely to me. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of earth warming under the sun, and I woke feeling lighter than I had in months. I made coffee and carried it to the porch, where the marigolds caught the early light and seemed to nod approval of my presence in their space. This was what home was supposed to feel like, not a stage where you performed someone else's idea of domestic happiness, but a place where you could simply be yourself without explanation or apology. The weeks that followed developed their own gentle rhythm. I woke when my body was ready rather than when alarm clocks demanded. I ate meals at tables where every place setting was mine to choose. I read books that interested me rather than ones that would impress visitors, and I discovered that silence could be companionship when it belonged to you rather than being imposed by loneliness or conflict. The greenhouse behind the cottage became my laboratory for experiments in self-sufficiency. I planted herbs that would flavor simple meals, vegetables that would provide fresh greens through the winter months, and flowers that bloomed just because I found them beautiful. The work was meditative, requiring attention without demanding perfection, allowing for the kind of mistakes that could be corrected without catastrophic consequences. Harold visited twice in the first month, once to help me fix a stubborn window that wouldn't open properly, and once simply to share the tomatoes from his garden that were ripening faster than one person could consume. We sat on my porch drinking iced tea and talking about the satisfaction of growing your own food, the pleasure of having neighbors who understood the difference between helping and interfering. "You look settled," he observed during his second visit, and I realized he was right. The cottage had absorbed me the way good soil absorbs water, completely, without waste, with the kind of efficiency that comes when conditions are exactly right for growth. 3 months after moving to the cottage, I received a card in the mail with no return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized as Sarah's. Inside was a photograph of Tyler working behind the counter of a small coffee shop, wearing an apron and smiling at customers with what looked like genuine contentment rather than the practiced charm I remembered from our bank meeting. On the back of the photograph, Sarah had written, "He's learning patience. Working to save money for a smaller venture. We both are learning things we should have known already." I propped the card on my kitchen windowsill next to the small pot of basil I'd started from seed, and every morning when I made my coffee, I was reminded that growth was possible even in relationships that had seemed beyond repair. Not the same growth I'd once hoped for, not the restoration of unconditional financial support or the return to a family dynamic that had never actually been healthy, but something more modest and more honest. The possibility that we might eventually find our way to a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation, on chosen connection rather than biological accident, on the kind of love that asks for honesty rather than compliance. As autumn deepened into winter, I established routines that belonged entirely to me. Morning coffee on the porch when the weather permitted, followed by work in the greenhouse where tomatoes continued to ripen under glass and herbs perfumed the air with their concentrated oils. Afternoon reading in the chair by the window, where I could watch the marigolds fade to brown and drop their seeds for next year's garden. Evenings were for simple cooking, meals designed for one person who had learned to appreciate the luxury of eating exactly what she wanted, when she wanted it, without negotiating preferences or accommodating dietary restrictions that belonged to other people. I discovered flavors I'd forgotten I enjoyed, ingredients I'd avoided because they didn't appeal to family members who were no longer sitting at my table. The cottage held me like cupped hands, protective but not possessive, secure but not confining. And somewhere in the space between the life I'd left and the life I was building, I began to understand what the word stay had always meant. Not remaining in places that diminished you, not accepting conditions that required you to compromise your fundamental values, not enduring relationships that cost more than they gave. But staying true to principles that had served you well, staying committed to values that had proven their worth, staying loyal to the person you'd worked decades to become rather than the person other people needed you to be. I stayed, with myself, and discovered that home isn't about where you live but about whether you can respect the person looking back from your mirror. The woman in my bathroom mirror had silver hair and lines around her eyes, hands marked by decades of work and worry, a face that had learned to speak truth even when truth was inconvenient. She looked familiar, but also new, like someone I'd known long ago and was just beginning to remember, someone who'd been waiting patiently for the noise of other people's demands to quiet enough that her own voice could be heard clearly. She looked like someone who understood that freedom wasn't loud, it was itemized, planted, tended, and harvested in seasons of her own choosing. Spring returned with the reliability of promises kept by forces larger than human intention, and the marigolds I'd planted from saved seeds pushed through the soil exactly where I'd scattered them. Some grew in the spots I'd intended, others found their own locations in corners of the garden where conditions suited them better than my careful planning had suggested. I learned to trust their judgment about where they wanted to grow, the same way I was learning to trust my own judgment about where I wanted to be, who I wanted to see, and how I wanted to spend the time that remained to me. The cottage had taught me that home was something you created rather than something you inherited, that family was something you chose rather than something you endured, that love was something you offered rather than something you owed. On warm evenings, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the marigolds dance in the breeze that carried the scent of earth and possibility through air that belonged to no one and everyone. The word stay had found its true meaning at last, not about geography or obligation, but about the courage to remain faithful to your own integrity even when that faithfulness required you to disappoint people who had confused your compliance with your love. I had stayed with the values my parents taught me about fiscal responsibility and the dignity of earning what you receive. I had stayed with the wisdom I'd gained from watching generous hearts lead to financial chaos. I had stayed with my own judgment about the difference between helping and enabling, between family love and family manipulation. Most importantly, I had stayed with myself, the woman who had been buried under years of other people's needs and expectations, the person who had almost forgotten that her opinions mattered as much as anyone else's, that her comfort was as worthy of protection as her family's convenience. The cottage surrounded me with the particular peace that comes from living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. In the greenhouse, herbs grew according to their nature rather than human schedules. In the garden, marigolds bloomed and faded and dropped seeds for future seasons without asking permission or requiring approval. And in the small rooms that had become home, I lived as I had never quite managed to live before, completely present to my own life, finally comfortable with the person I had always been but had never quite had the courage to be completely. The word stay no longer sounded like an ultimatum or an obligation. It sounded like choice, like wisdom, like the decision to remain faithful to the best parts of yourself even when that faithfulness required you to walk away from everything you had once believed you needed. I stayed, with myself, and learned that some departures are really arrivals, that some losses are actually discoveries, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the people who claim to love you most. In the end, staying meant something I had never imagined when my daughter first spoke the word across my dining room table. It meant choosing dignity over convenience, wisdom over sentiment, self-respect over family approval. It meant learning that home was not a place you inherited but a piece you created, not a building you maintained but a relationship you cultivated with the person you saw in your mirror each morning. And as the seasons turned and the marigolds bloomed and faded and bloomed again, I discovered that staying with yourself was not the selfish act I had been taught to believe it was, but the most generous gift you could give to a world that needed more people who knew the difference between love and leverage, between helping and enabling, between family obligation and genuine care. The cottage held my peace like a promise kept, and I held my own life like the treasure it had always been, valuable not because other people needed it, but because it was mine to live according to my own understanding of what it meant to stay true, to stay strong, to stay faithful to the best of what I had learned in 73 years of practicing how to be human in a world that often confused compliance with love.